Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host, Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme of one album bands. Looking at bands who only ever put out one album, just dropped something great and then just disappeared into the fog, leaving us wondering why they didn't give us more phenomenal art. Today we're going to be looking at Nova Collective, their track The Further Side from, well, it's the title track of the album, The Further Side. So let's dig into this and see what Nova Collective is giving us today. Oh, oh. Interesting not to raise that. Beautiful Steven groove right here. I love the way the guitar and the piano are kind of playing off of each other. Oh, very tasteful drum fill. Whoa. This guitarist, they have jazz training. It might not be where they started, but they went and learned some traditional jazz somewhere in their journey. Oh man, this polyrhythm. That's the second time they've done that. Abruptly stop, silence, new section. Normally I'd hold it against them, but we've already had some really smooth ideas. This pianist has had some jazz in their journey as well. Beautiful transition with that accelerando. The rising tension in the note intervals moving up that line. That was so clean. love the bass leading this section. So many little spicy ideas throughout this track. I love the ghost notes on the drum. It keeps the energy moving forward while keeping everything a bit lighter on the feet. Yeah, very jazzy. Hitting on all those offbeats. Bass just laying down some groove right here. If they had ended this about a minute prior to when they did, I'd have nothing but praise for this track. And that's not to say I don't appreciate the ending. I think there are some neat things in there. We got that microtonal guitar line that came in that, I don't know, was simultaneously consonant and dissonant at the same time. It's just weird microtonal stuff going on. And it sounds neat. It does. I don't want to discredit that. But aside from that, I don't think it added anything to the song. So it's really cool in isolation, but the song was over. We had our piano line, we had a really nice rising and falling of ideas, and we brought it down just the piano, doing those simple runs, beautiful runs actually. And that ritard onto the fermata at the end, just really stretching time and putting so much space between these final notes. And when we get to the resolving notes, when we get back to the root note of the chord, instead of getting the piano, we get a massive sound that takes that root note and also puts a chord on top of it that directs us somewhere else. We were expecting resolution, and instead we got another quest. We were expecting the end, and we were pointed somewhere else. It says, your ending is in another castle. So we go venturing on, and unfortunately, this next section just isn't anything great. It's cool on its own, but in contrast to what we had heard so far, and the fact that it is continuously cyclical. A lot of the stuff we've heard had cycles underneath but was linear on top, and this was just completely cyclical with minor variation. I, I don't feel like it justified its time comparatively to how other sections justified theirs through linearity and melody writing, and I don't feel like it justified the extension of the track. It had a lot of weight put on it. It not only had to be a good section upon itself, it not only had to be a good section against the rest of the song, but it also had to be a good ending. And not only that, but it had to be a good extension of an ending. We had a traditional ending already, and it was interrupted for this. This needs to be rather important. It needs to do something interesting, and I just feel it doesn't. If that section were in the middle of the track, I would just say, okay, that was a bit lackluster, but everything else made up for it. But because it was the last thing that we heard, and because it interrupted a natural ending for it, its disappointment is exponentially larger. And it could just be that I don't understand its purpose. I'm not going to say that I have a very strong read of any thematic or narrative elements to this track. It sounds like a bunch of really cool sections that are strung together in both harsh and smooth ways, and there's a lot of sections in here that I absolutely love, but I don't really see anything connective between them. I didn't really get too much of an emotional exploration through a lot of it. That tends to be true on a first time listen for anything a bit more complex like this for me personally. Atmosphere is kind of secondary to when I'm trying to just understand the basis of what they're doing in their melody. I don't really have time to dig into the emotions when there's so many gears going along that I have to focus on the minutia. Um, and without getting that bigger picture, I don't really know what the story was, where an interruption to it and a fake out to an ending would make sense for it. Just on a purely musical level, I am a bit underwhelmed with where they went at the end, and I would have wished that we had ended with the piano part, but that could change with subsequent listens, it could change with more information, it could change with knowing the authorial intent. What was their intentions behind the fake out into the second ending. Um, all of that could change my opinion, but first time reaction, I kind of wish it wasn't there. Now, before we dig into anything else, I just want to say something real quick. It's going to be a short section here. Joke's on me, this is probably going to be like a 10-minute timestamp. My hypothesis is that our guitarist and pianist have jazz training somewhere in their musical journey. The bassist probably does not, but is self taught simply by listening to jazz bassists, maybe not as much as they do with other bassists. But they have a little bit of exposure to it, and the same goes for the drummer. And that is primarily because the melodic driven elements in here are exceptionally jazzy. A lot of the guitar ostinatos or licks, riffs, whatever you want to call them, and the piano melodies are very jazzy. The note relationships are jazzy. The chord progressions are jazzy. The use of diving out of keys and selecting specific notes, what those notes are that are selected outside of the key, is very jazzy. Very jazz fusion, actually, if you want a specific era of jazz. Um, we talk about this often, even with metal guitarists, of pulling notes outside of the chord to introduce a little bit of spice and zest. But there's different flavors that get pulled in for different types of genres. And metal tends to go a bit more dissonant. They go for heavier amounts of spice, if we can stick with the metaphor. Whereas jazz tends to go for lighter spices until you get into bebop, and then sometimes those guys are just like, yeah, let's just go full on dissonance. Um, but there's a particular type of notes that get selected in jazz when you pull outside of a chord. It's not just pulling any random note from outside of your key. It is particularly pulling specific intervals or specific variants of specific slots or steps, um, out of an adjacent key. And that's the other thing too. Again, it's not just random notes. They are from adjacent keys, which usually makes the note selected not too far removed, and really helps with a uniformity within the spice. And in this track, I hear a lot of that jazzy type of note selection when they decide to get outside the key and explore other ideas. It's a specific adherence to a type of consonants that the key is suggesting already. Like I said, the transitions, the chord progressions, the way that we shift from four chord progressions to transitionary progressions, where we move through a series of chords that are not designed to be looped, but are designed to take us to a new series of chords, a new progression. Those intervals that we have on those chords are exceptionally jazz fusiony. And so the melody, the harmony, a lot of these elements that the piano and guitar tend to play are super jazzy. But then we get to the bass, and I listened into the bass for a few sections, primarily just, excluding everything else. What is the bass doing here? And consistently, I heard a rock bass idea. There was no situation where I heard a walking bass line. I never heard the guitarist leading the band either in rhythm or in chord. It was usually some sort of, well, we did have a few sections that were pedal tone based, and a few sections where there was a melody, but it was a one bar loop that followed a chord progression, but the idea itself, the lick itself, didn't change. It just altered the pitch based on what chord we were on. All of these are very rock ideas. You don't see any of this happen too often in jazz. And for the drumming, a lot of it is very heavy-handed and focused on noise. And when I say that, I simply mean the idea of creating sound. Prog Fusion was a little different because Prog Fusion began to incorporate elements of rock, so Prog Fusion drumming kind of sounds a little bit like rock of the time. But like I had mentioned, the piano and the guitar were implementing ideas that even go back to earlier styles of jazz, whereas the drum seems to be firmly cemented in either jazz fusion or modern rock. And so there was that one section with the ghost notes where the drummer backed off both in intensity and in frequency. If we ignore the ghost notes and look at just the accented hits, it was very sparse. And jazz drumming tends to be a bit on the sparser side until you get into super fast or, fast swing or jazz fusion. And so that tells me at least that they're a rock drummer first, and maybe they explored a little bit of jazz, maybe particularly jazz fusion because it has that rock edge to it, but that they don't have a lot of swing or salsa or any of the slower jazzes under their belt. So, like I said, that kind of tells me that half this group was sort of possibly jazz first or heavily entrenched in jazz education of some sort. And the other half are dabble in jazz but are primarily rock based. And that creates an interesting sound for this track in which it's difficult to place because it simultaneously, I mean, all of it kind of fits in jazz fusion. If I had to give this a genre, jazz fusion would be it. But it kind of dabbles on both sides of jazz fusion, the side that jazz took in rock ideas and the side that rock and specifically prog rock took in jazz ideas. It sits on both sides of these spectrums and even stretches out a bit past that, reaching further back into more traditional jazzes and reaching forward into more modern rock. And so it is this interesting amalgamation of a lot of different sounds that comes together into something that feels both new and familiar all at the same time. And I really dig that. Like I need to check right now, just so I don't forget later. But I'm pretty sure Nova Collective is on my list of things to check out. But if it's not, it is definitely going there because, yeah, it's already on the list. I don't know how it's on the list, but the name was semi familiar, and this sound is just right up my alley. So, yeah, just it's so good. And like I said, it's familiar and new and fresh all at the same time, which is honestly for me the sweet spot. I love things that are completely fresh, completely pushes my boundaries to what music is, but those are usually things that I appreciate on an artistic merit and that I will have been exceptionally happy to listen to once, but something I probably wouldn't come back to again. And this, I think, sits in that nice realm where it pushes my boundaries maybe just a little bit, not as much as something more experimental could, but is something I could return to frequently. Something that I might have an itch that it could scratch. And it's also kind of unique in some ways as well, especially with the way that they merge all these different eras of music across these two genres, that there isn't a lot out there that I think could scratch this itch the same way this does, especially without lyrics. I think that's a really strong aspect to it because a lot of the prog fusion that we've had on the channel has been sort of prog rock oriented and has lyrics much like rock would, and not so much the uh, vocalless jazz elements. Uh, so yeah, that's sort of just like an overview of things. I wish we could get into more depth, but this is an extremely complex song. I do want to touch on a couple of things that I think they do exceptionally well, though, and one is just transitions. Right? So they do have a couple of harsh ones, and they utilize this one twice where they play a bunch of notes that are increasing in intensity and then just stop, and then they give you a beat or two of silence and start the next idea. I'm not as big of a fan of those, but in contrast, I think they work. Um, because a majority of the time we do get these phenomenally smooth transitions. Sometimes, like I had mentioned earlier, we get these chord progressions that move us from one progression that we loop to the next progression that we're going to loop. And we get this transition progression of 4 to 8 chords that changes the emotion and atmosphere of where we were and slowly metamorphosizes the song into where we're going. So we can land there and it feels very natural to have arrived in this new sound sphere with this new emotive atmosphere. That was always exceptionally well done, and I don't know who's the composer on this. It could be a group effort, it could just be one or two of the people. I don't know. For all I know, this could be a solo project, right? Um, where was I going with that? But yeah. Anyways, whoever is composing this, group effort or solo effort, they have an exceptional grasp over chord theory, which I think is honestly the key to a lot of the composition of this track. Um, Even when we look at the melodies themselves, most of the melodies aren't anything mind blowing. We don't have wild rhythmic ideas. A lot of it is rather palatable on the micro level. What's really interesting about a lot of the solos and melody lines is how they play off of each other's notes, creating chords, and how they utilize notes outside of the key to create these compound keys, which all of that ties back into chord theory, knowing what notes to play when based on the chord you're in, the chord that came before it, and the chord that you're aiming to go to afterwards. And utilizing really interesting chord progressions, not even necessarily looped ones, but linear chord progressions to achieve specific emotive sounds and feelings. Um, there's just a lot of lesser used ideas in here that sound very fresh to me. I don't know if it's just because I hear them so infrequently or if it's that they are, well, they're not exploring new combinations because there's a finite number of combinations and we've been exploring music for a long time. I don't think anybody's making up new combinations of chords anymore. Um, but yeah, so it must just be that they're utilizing underutilized chord progressions and strings and series that just sound phenomenal together. All of it is done in a consonant way that is harmonious and beautiful. There's definitely ways that you can utilize chord progressions and series in ways that create tension or darkness or dissonance, in and new ways that not new ways but underutilized ways, because most people don't aim for dissonance in their music. But no, this group right here, everything is about beauty. Even when we hit dissonant tones, such as the microtonal stuff in our real outro, um, even within that though, there's still elements of beauty. Like I said, it's a mixing of consonance and dissonance with those microtones, and that is just it's still going for an element of beauty. Even coming off of our intro, which seemed to be entirely dissonant, I think in retrospect was actually microtones, and I just wasn't ready for it. And there's probably a lot of beauty in that as well, because the rest of the track relishes in gorgeous soundscapes and chord progressions. It's just marvelous. Um, so yeah, their transitions are just well, there's another. Oh yeah. The other transition. I think the whole point I brought this up. There was one transition I wanted to talk about. We almost skipped over it. Um, it was a solo piano, I think, with maybe the bass and drums doing something under it, and it was building up into their next section, which was a little faster and was a little higher in pitch. Oh, we got to talk about that too. Contrast. A little higher in pitch and a little wider. And so we get this piano line that slowly takes us up in pitch, but also increases the speed. We have a nice accelerando going on there as well, but the piano also gets louder, the bass gets louder, the drums get louder, and then eventually the guitars come in. And it's this really nice swelling on like three dimensions of moving into this next concept, while also their signature chordal progression as well, of taking us from one place to the next through the emotions of the chords. And it's just, I think, the perfect microcosm to explain everything I love about this group. It's the attention to detail, it's the contrast, it's the expert placement and utilization of specific concepts in composition. It is dynamic qualities on every axis, and just masterful control over all of it to craft tracks that take the listener on a journey. And speaking of the dynamic elements, this song has volume highs, volume lows, and these are actual highs and lows. I was watching the audio visualizer, and it's not just like they were making it sound quieter but keeping it at the full volume. There's volume differences, there's width differences, there's speed differences all over the place, there's time signature differences, which were just so cool. I think this is one of the parts, I kind of downplayed the drums earlier by saying that they kind of brought more of a rock focus in whereas our two melody instruments kind of stole the spotlight with the jazzier concepts. But that's not actually true, because in a lot of these sections, especially one of the earlier 7/8s, I think it was, the way that they implement groove in these odd time signatures is infectious. Not only is it interesting to break down, I think it would be fascinating to try to transpose this and figure out what exactly the drummer is doing within these polymetric and polyrhythmic ideas. But also, it is just really easy to listen to and to get into a groove. You don't really feel the oddities of the time signature at all, and that is completely up to our rhythm section to help pave over. The bass and the drums both do a fantastic job here of helping the listener to navigate some of these odd time signatures in a way that doesn't make them feel as odd. If you really pay attention to them, there is, like in that opening one, a really heavy emphasis on one, which gives it almost this feeling of a drop at the end. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, and you kind of get that drop when you come back down to the one rather than going to the eight. And you know, I usually count it because counting that fast, I'm not a big fan of. So I usually count it in four. I just wouldn't give four the whole beat. So I'd 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and you can really feel the drop there, where that fourth beat is only half as long. And so, you know, you can kind of get into that groove as well, but there is a larger groove at play here that the drums and bass emphasize as well, that is symmetrical on the 14, on the 2-bar long idea. And they don't play around with this idea where they only accent downbeats, where if you follow that overarching 2-bar idea, you emphasize downbeats and then you emphasize offbeats. It actually moves through a rather groovy idea where the emphasis feels like it's symmetrical all the time, both within the 14 bar and against the 14 beat and the 7 beat. It's just masterful rhythmic play in our rhythm section, which I would say is probably where the bassist and drummer shine the most. If our piano and guitar are shining in their jazzy, masterful chord theory, then our rhythm section shines in rhythmic navigation. And I think without them, if they were replaced with most any other drummer and bass, I think this would be a song that is still interesting on a theoretical level, as far as chord and emotion and atmosphere and melody go, but would be more difficult to navigate for the listener. And it almost makes their job like the hidden, I don't know, hidden foundation. I don't know where I'm going with this. We don't really notice how important their jobs are, but when you do notice, you're like, dang, the song would fall apart without them. Um, and it's just, they're so important to the track. And I feel a little bad about downplaying them earlier, but I was just not perceiving their contributions in the proper angle. So yeah, there's no lyrics on this track. I don't have anything to break down there, and like I said, I don't really have an emotional read. That's typical on more complex first listens. I'm paying more attention to the nuance than the way that I'm feeling the song or the emotions or the story it's telling. So I'm gonna wrap this up. Those are my thoughts on Nova Collective's The Further Side. What did you think? Was there anything that stood out to you? Was there anything that I said that you would like to add on to? Maybe I didn't dig in too far enough, or maybe you disagree with me on, or just want to correct me on. Maybe I misspoke. Let me know down in the comments. Above the comment section is a description box, and there's a link for Linktree. It takes you here. You can find a link to the Discord server, ways to support the channel, and a link to my music. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. All right, we have a special selection coming up. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC, as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.